Mass democracy can be a complete disaster. That's the lesson I got from Ian Smith's The Great Betrayal, his memoirs talking about his experience as leading Rhodesia during its turbulent times and its temporary existence in southern Africa. So Rhodesia was originally a colony by Great Britain, and then it declared independence from Great Britain around, I think, the 1960s, and then for like a decade and a half, it was like an unrecognized state trying to survive. Today, it's modern Zimbabwe, but essentially, the government was ran by whites, the former original British settlers whose descendants were running the country, and they had run under the idea of called it merit democracy, essentially. So only people who could vote were people who met certain income and property ownership requirements. And the intent of that was to have voting that would give better long-term results. In effect, it essentially meant that, it was more of a white minority dominated government. There were blacks in it who either participated who voted or were representatives, or there were chiefs from the rural areas who also were politically involved as well. But essentially, it was a white minority dominated government as a consequence of that system. And the idea was, Ian Smith, and the other whites, they wanted to avoid, they were resisting the demand by the British government and the world to essentially become to allow mass democracy. So let everybody vote. They did not want that. Whites were a very small minority of the entire population. So they essentially were trying to resist that attempt. And the British government, what they did was they did blockades, economic sanctions. The U.S. as well. They isolated Rhodesia economically, but Rhodesia survived for a long time up until 1979, 1980. They were able to survive. But so Ian Smith, during that, up until from 1965 to 1980, he's leading Rhodesia and their resistance to not give in to the demand for a black majority rule. They made adjustments, changes, but his objective was to avoid a situation where Rhodesia would allow majority rule. The fear was that they would end up like other African countries that tried democracy. The saying was one man, one vote, one time. That ended up, a lot of that countries became either dictatorships that tried it, they became dictatorships, one party rule, and everything was destroyed. A lot of African countries that happened to, unfortunately. So that their fear was they'd end up like that, as well as they were afraid of being massacred, because during decolonization, a lot of the whites who were living in the African countries, they ended up either getting horrible things happened during that process. But his whole discussion in the book is him trying to protect Rhodesia from self-destruction. I don't want to defend some parts of it. I mean, it's like that's different opinions or whatever. But to me, what I found about the book that was so enticing and interesting was his argument about mass democracy. What they wanted to do was they wanted to eventually get to black majority rule, but they wanted to be an evolutionary process, right? Their argument was that they said they would happen eventually, but they needed people to reach certain standards, education-wise, economy-wise. Their argument was that people did not have experience and enough experience in time to know how it works. Obviously sounds very paternalistic, but his argument was that, the whites in the country, they've had experience with democracy from the Britain in years. They brought the British system there. They know how it works, and their argument was they wanted to limit voting because they wanted to, the reason why there was no mass democracy in Rhodesia was because, the fear was of mob rule, right? That's one of the dangers, is that if everyone can vote, people will vote for policy it's not either well thought out, it's too short term, right? If people who have things to lose in a country, they're more likely, like they have property, they're more likely to vote in a way that protects the country for long term wise. So that is the reason why democracy was so limited, is their argument. If you let everybody vote, it'll be just mob rule, right? It'll be just people voting based on emotion, based on the short-term thinking, people just wanting stuff. right? That was the biggest fear. And this could be either, and it could end up being multiple ways. It could be a majority of, people who are black against the whites, or it could be ethnically between different black groups. That is the fear of allowing mass democracy, and I understand his point. I look at today, if you look in America or even local city politics, a lot of people don't know much about what's going on in their city, what's going on locally. They don't know their city council person or their congressman. They don't know any of that. They don't care, or they don't focus on that, and they don't know their mayor. And and they vote when it comes down to it, but the voter is really dumb. I mean, it is a true fact of life that democracy can be really stupid when you let anybody vote, right? And people will vote, when people vote for redistribution, they'll vote for destruction, they'll vote for a lot of terrible things, you know? So that is one reason why I understand you don't want this. I mean, look at the U.S. right now. We're literally having over $36 trillion in debt. The U.S. is heading toward an economic disaster, and it's because people are voting for high spending policies. They're spending money, and the spending can't stop through political process. I mean, Doge couldn't cut it back, and the biggest spending items are entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and any politician who touches those things could lose their job and lose elections. So there's no incentive to actually to deal with the huge debt and deficit spending of the U.S. government. So that is an unfortunate outcome of doing stuff like this. So that was his argument. That was the consequence of fear. And eventually, what had happened was that the government did become full mass democracy. It was kind of controversial how it was done, but they had mass democracy, and eventually Mugabe came into power, and the country just became shit. It was destroyed under his leadership. They did a lot of mass land redistribution from the whites to the blacks. They spent a ton of money causing mass inflation. They caused famines. Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa, a place people wanted to go to. It had high standard of living, although went to the toilet. There were massacres of different ethnic groups. Mugabe, he was a leader of who was a part of the Showa tribe, did crimes against the Metebele, right? So all these horrible things, and then there was nothing to stop him. And they suppressed vote. They suppressed freedom of speech. Elections kept being stolen. And the thing is, he won his elections through intimidation. A lot of people who voted for him were just intimidated to or terrorized into voting for him. And then some people did vote for him because of his promises. But he came into power and destroyed the whole country. And I think that's one of the problems of mass democracy. Often is the people who end up getting into power are not good people or not smart people. Like, the quality of the candidates are often a reflection of the quality of voters. The winners are a reflection of the voting people, right? And that's what happened. And now Zimbabwe lives a lot on foreign aid. It's not economically doing well, and it suffers. And I think mass democracy has never been fully for everybody.
On
It's always been limited to some reason,
to the port of Beira in the north, and Lorenzo
the
Marx in
Greeks
the
used
south.
to, I think,
Yesterday,
a limitation that you
Mozambique
had to at
became a
least
black independent state.
have
If she
be a
closes her
soldier in the
border,
military to be allowed to
Rhodesia
vote.
will have to rely on the already
There's
overloaded
always
links through
historically been ways to
Botswana
limit the
and
voting
Beitbridge to South
public
Africa.
in
The
general.
strains will be enormous.
And
Prime Minister, what will happen
it definitely
if Mozambique
it's
does
mass.
close her
I mean, the
border?
takeaway is mass democracy is overrated, for sure, right? You can. I'm not saying whether I don't like looking back at things like Rhodesia was better managed by Ian Smith and his group. I don't want to talk like that. Past, but I think the lesson should be is that
those contingency plans rely heavily
I think
on.
it could have ended up better. I mean, there are multiple points that Ian Smith says that they had made agreements with the moderates or the smarter nationalists, but the international community just wouldn't budge on the agreements of political participation. Like, they demanded that the communists, which is Mugabe and his crew, be allowed to. They have to approve of the agreement. They have to be part of the negotiating table. Ian Smith and his group, they did not want to include them, and unfortunately, they did. Like I think the biggest takeaway for me in general is that mass democracy can be a problem. Like there's definitely it's not the best form of government. There are other forms of government. Some societies work better under different forms, and I don't agree with Winston Churchill's statement that democracy is the best form out of all the other ones. I think there are other forms. I think other societies have different forms of government. Some work better with monarchy. Some work better with strongmen. I think some societies just have it better with different forms. For Rhodesia, I think it could have been worked out differently. That doesn't mean democracy can't work. I think it can with the right people there, with enough experience there, it can work. But yeah, I don't know how to end this, but I think that people should take into heart how Rhodesia failed and how mass democracy can be a total joke and sham.